What are you doing? And what's with that suitcase?
I'm not leaving you for Warren, Kendrick. I'm leaving because for 15 years, I've been ashamed every time I introduced my husband as a mechanic.
Ashamed of the work? Or ashamed you never asked what it built?
The number doesn't matter. I just needed a man who doesn't make me lower my head at dinner parties.
Have you read the license behind the counter?
A paper on a wall doesn't wash grease off your hands. What that?
That grease is the smell of 7 garages carrying my family's name. You just said you were ashamed of the thing paying for this house.
My name is Kendrick Monroe. I'm 43 years old, and for 26 years I've believed one thing without wavering. The man who shows up quietly, every single day, is the one still standing long after the noise fades. That belief was about to be tested by a man in a cashmere coat who didn't even know my last name. It was 6:08 in the morning, the second week of November, on Livernois Avenue in Detroit. Monroe Motor Works had just flipped its lights on. The concrete floor was still damp from snowmelt tracked in off the street. I was flat on my back under a Chevrolet Suburban, listening to a knock in the suspension that didn't belong there. That's when I heard it. A car with almost no engine noise, just tires grinding against wet concrete. A black Porsche Taycan pulled up and blocked the service bay door. Not parked, blocked. The way a man parks when he's never once had to wait for anything in his life. The man who stepped out was tall, maybe 6'1", built lean and precise, the way money builds a man instead of labor does. A close taper fade with the top brushed into a neat, deliberate wave. A trimmed beard sharp enough to look drawn on with a ruler. Warm caramel skin and a charcoal cashmere coat over shoes too clean for a Detroit street in November. I knew his name before he said it. I'd seen it typed in texts my wife hadn't quite finished deleting off our family tablet. Warren Calloway. Here's the part I want you to sit with. Warren didn't recognize me. He looked right at me, grease on my hands, Kendrick stitched over my chest, and saw exactly one thing: a mechanic. He handed me his card, smiling the whole time he said it. The kind of smile that reaches the mouth a full second before it ever reaches the eyes. Give this to your boss. Tell him Warren Calloway wants to buy this place before the land's worth more than the work you people are doing on it. Remember that sentence. Before this story's over, you'll understand just how wrong it was. I looked under his Porsche and saw a thin streak of coolant already pooling on my clean floor. Your car's got a problem, I said. It's still under warranty, he told me. Warranty doesn't stop a battery pack from overheating. He walked off, certain he'd just finished a conversation with an ordinary grease monkey. With no idea, he'd just insulted the one man in Detroit who could end his plans with a signature. Before we get into how a 7-key ring, one stolen file, and a woman who once called me an upgrade-downgrade would end up costing Warren Calloway everything, let me take you back to who I actually am, and how an ordinary Tuesday became the morning my marriage came apart. I started in this garage at 17, beside my father, who built Monroe Motor Works out of a single bay when the banks wouldn't lend a black man in this city a dime. I still clock in like everybody else. I still drink black coffee out of a steel thermos. I still drive his old Ford F-150, because some things you don't retire. You carry them forward. Behind the counter hangs a business license reading Monroe Legacy Holdings. My wife had walked past that paper hundreds of times. She never once stopped to read it. That same morning, a 19-year-old apprentice named Devin Freeman came in late, nervous I'd dock his pay. I handed him a flashlight and told him to listen to a rattling Ford Escape. Don't listen for the loudest sound, I told him. Listen for the sound that shouldn't be there at all. He found a worn wheel bearing hiding under a loose belt. Someday, I told him, you'll be the one teaching somebody else to hear that. That evening I drove home to Rosedale Park, where my wife was getting ready for a fundraiser downtown. She didn't ask how my day went. "Can you shower before you come into the living room?" she said. "The smell of oil gets into everything." I'd already washed my hands twice. What lingered on me wasn't the problem. It was everything I represented that she wanted to walk away from. "Why don't you hire somebody else for the hands-on work?" she asked. "Because there are sounds only a man who's pulled an engine apart with his own hands ever learns to hear." "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You take pride in things you should have outgrown by now." I didn't argue. I just hung my coat up and watched her fasten the silver earrings I'd bought her for our anniversary. The same earrings I'd once given up a garage of my own to help pay for. That night, coming home from locking up the shop and checking the cameras, I found 2 suitcases by the staircase. Melody sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, the way a person sits when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. She told me she'd been in love with Warren Calloway for 7 months. He had vision, she said. He understood the world she wanted to live in. She'd felt buried in our marriage. "When did you start feeling buried?" I asked. She didn't give me a date, only lines she'd practiced. "I tried. I need to live my truth. We grew in 2 different directions." Then she looked me dead in the eye. "Warren is an upgrade, Kendrick. He's building a future. You just fix things that are already broken." I didn't raise my voice. I asked her one question instead. "How many of Monroe's files did you hand him?" She froze. "Just a few partnership numbers. Nothing important." "Do you know who those numbers belong to?" "Your family," she said. "But you just work there." That single sentence told me everything. My own wife didn't know I owned the company she'd just handed a stranger the keys to. My phone buzzed before I could answer. The Livernois security system was flagging unusual access. 3 minutes before Warren showed up that morning, a silver SUV had parked across the street. A man inside had photographed our breaker panel, our staff license plates, and our side door lock. His jacket carried the logo of a real estate appraisal firm. I turned the screen toward Melody. "Did you tell Warren when the shop runs light on people?" She admitted he'd asked about our hours and when I usually left to make deliveries. She thought he only wanted to look at the land. "A man who only wants to look at land," I told her, "doesn't test a back door lock." I walked into my father's old office and called our family attorney, Harmony Brooks. "Harmony," I said, "I need to know how many doors my wife just opened for that man." "Do you think this is a divorce?" she asked. "Or a business problem?" I looked again at the footage of a stranger testing our back door. "I think Warren's using one to get the other." I stood there a long moment, looking at 7 brass keys my father had left me. Keys Melody had never once asked about in 15 years of marriage. Something bigger than an affair had already started, and I was the only one who knew it. I didn't sleep that night. By 6, I was back on Livernois, because grief doesn't pay the light bill. I didn't tell my crew about the divorce. I changed into my uniform, opened the bay doors, and checked the day's appointments like any other Tuesday. When one of my techs asked if I was all right, I told him, "We've got 6 vehicles going out on time today." My people didn't need to carry my pain on top of their own workload. Devon caught me at the parts counter before I'd poured coffee. Somebody had called the shop late the night before, asking who held the keys to the back entrance, which manager worked which shift, and whether we owned this land or leased it. The caller claimed to be with an insurance company. Devon gave up nothing. The number came back through a relay service, untraceable by design. Whatever had happened with that silver SUV wasn't a one-time thing. I drove to see Harmony Brooks that afternoon near Woodward Avenue. Harmony had handled Monroe family business since before my father passed, and she wasn't the type to get pulled into the emotional wreckage of an affair. She went straight to the facts. What systems did Melody have access to? Who did she send information to? Did Warren have a real estate entity tied to this? And had there been any formal offer to purchase? She laid the structure out plainly. Monroe Motor Works runs 7 locations. Monroe Legacy Holdings owns the brand, the equipment, and 5 parcels of land under those shops. I hold 74% of the voting shares. My mother, Justice Monroe, holds 16%. The remaining 10 belongs to a long-standing employee welfare fund my father set up decades ago. "You're not allowed to hide assets in a divorce," Harmony told me. "But disclosing to a court is different than your wife actually knowing who you are." That line sat heavy, because it was true on both counts. I hadn't broken any law, but I'd let a marriage run for 15 years with a gap in it wide enough to drive a truck through. Harmony mentioned something else in passing, a document called the Monroe Stewardship Plan. I told her we didn't need it yet. I had no idea how much that file would matter before this was over. We went through the family computer my wife used to keep at the house. Buried in the files was something titled Detroit Independent Auto Portfolio. 38 pages covering customer traffic, insurance contracts, land values, and ownership notes. Next to the Livernois location, Melody had written, "On-site manager, older, conservative, no signs of expansion." She meant me. She'd looked at my steadiness every single day and read it as evidence I had no plan, no ambition, nothing left to build. I think what Melody actually wanted wasn't Warren's money. It was the feeling of being seen, walking into rooms where, in her mind, the real decisions of the world got made. Underneath that hunger sat a quieter fear, that if she stayed still much longer, people would decide she'd settled, especially after watching 2 college friends make partner that same year while she was still explaining what her husband did for a living. Warren didn't create that fear. He just arrived at the exact moment she needed someone to hand her proof she'd chosen ambition over comfort. She mistook my steadiness for my ceiling, because nobody had ever shown her that a foundation and a ceiling aren't the same thing. The file was numbered 1 through 38, but page 25 was missing. Some of what filled those other pages I recognized. Reports and vendor invoices I used to leave on the kitchen table years ago, back when Melody offered to help me file expense records and organize supplier paperwork on nights I was too tired to do it myself. I'd stopped bringing work home once the shops multiplied past 3, but she'd kept the habit of asking, and I'd kept handing her things without thinking twice. I never imagined she was building something out of them instead of putting them away. Harmony checked the access log. Another device had opened that file, a tablet registered as TB-Fleet. I knew that device. It belonged to Melody's older brother, Tyrone Bennett. I called him. He didn't deny opening it. Melody had asked him to fix a sync error, and in doing so, he'd seen page 25 and quietly pulled it before sending the file back. That page listed our key managers by name, their estimated salaries, their years of service, and notes on which ones looked unhappy enough to leave, along with bonus figures Warren could use to pull them away. "He's not just trying to buy a garage," Tyrone told me. "He wants to strip your best people out first, so what's left looks weak enough to buy cheap." A few days later, our HR lead confirmed our lead technician at 8 Mile Road had already been offered a 30% raise by a company tied to Warren. He hadn't accepted, just gone quiet, afraid mentioning it would make him look disloyal. "Getting an offer isn't betrayal," I told him. "Sitting on a problem until it takes the whole team down, that's betrayal." Tyrone met me again at a diner near Michigan Avenue, and what he told me reshaped the whole story in my head. 6 months before Melody ever mentioned Warren's name, Warren had approached Tyrone at a fleet conference, asking what role Melody held, whether she had access to partnership data, how our marriage was doing, and whether I actually owned anything or just worked for my family. He might have been drawn to her, Tyrone said, but he knew she was useful before he ever decided she was irresistible. That same week, Tyrone laid something else on my kitchen table: the spare key to Melody's mother's house on East Jefferson Avenue. 7 years earlier, her mother had a minor stroke while Tyrone was working out of state. For 9 months, I closed the shop early 3 days a week, drove her mother to physical therapy, managed her medication, and slept in a recliner beside her hospital bed while still opening the garage by 4:30 every morning. Later, I overheard Melody tell someone at a party that she'd carried her mother's crisis alone. I was standing right there holding 2 drinks she'd asked me to fetch. I set them down and walked away without correcting her. There was also a letter Harmony found, an offer 10 years back to run a regional service network across Chicago, Indianapolis, and Cleveland at 3 times my salary. I'd already bought a suitcase. 3 days before I was set to sign, Melody was diagnosed with a benign tumor requiring surgery and couldn't stand an empty waiting room. I turned the job down and never told her how big it had been. She later used my own words, "I'm exactly where I need to be," as proof I lacked drive. That evening, I brought Devin down to the storage floor most customers never see, and for the first time showed him what was underneath: workbenches, stripped engines, safety lockers, new tools, 20 apprentice files. Monroe's Skills Lab had been 18 months in the making. Paid apprenticeships, diagnostic training, money management, credit building, a real path toward owning a small shop someday. One of our newest applicants turned out to be the younger brother of the very technician Warren was trying to poach, meaning one man's financial decision could cost 2 generations in the same family their futures. Melody called that night from Warren's apartment, certain she was doing me a favor. "At least you could stop working yourself into the ground," she said. "Who do you think pays 7 managers?" I asked. "Your family," she said, "not you." "Have you ever read the license behind the counter?" Silence. "That's where I work every single day," I told her. "You've never stood in front of it long enough to actually read it." A few days later, Harmony told me the divorce paperwork was moving forward. I didn't try to stop it. I only asked for 20 minutes alone with Melody before mediation. "You're not trying to win her back," Harmony said. It wasn't really a question. "No," I told her. "I want her to understand what she decided before a lawyer turns it into a number." I took 7 brass keys out of the safe. Into one folder, I placed a photograph of a Buick, the spare key to a house on East Jefferson Avenue, a 10-year-old letter from Dearborn, and the blueprint from Monroe's Skills Lab. The next day, I wasn't planning to tell Melody I was richer than Warren. I was planning to show her exactly how the man she'd called small had spent 15 years quietly holding up everything that was still standing. Team Truth. Lay every hidden sacrifice on that table tomorrow morning. Or Team Silence. Let her walk away, never knowing what she actually gave up. Comment your team below. Stick around. What Melody sees on that kitchen table is about to change everything she thought she knew about the man she left. My wife arrived at the house in Rosedale Park driving a Mercedes Warren had leased for her. Not bought, leased, though she didn't seem to notice the difference yet. She was put together the way she always was for important moments, but I could see the cracks underneath. Faint shadows under her eyes, her thumb pressing against her ring finger. She thought I wanted to beg, maybe negotiate. Her lawyer and mine waited outside in separate cars. I didn't ask her to sit right away. I set 7 brass keys on the kitchen table, each tagged with an address. Livernois Avenue, Grand River Avenue, Michigan Avenue, East Jefferson Avenue, Woodward Avenue, 8 Mile Road, and a 7th, our newest location, still being finished on the east side. She looked at them a long moment before she understood these weren't spares. You told me I had 1 garage, I said. I want you to understand what you've actually been walking past for 15 years. I told her about my grandfather, who opened our first shop when banks in this city wouldn't lend a black family a dime. I told her about my father, who bought land, parcel by parcel, before this part of Detroit ever got expensive. I told her how I built the rest myself. Night classes in business management, a shared parts network across locations, 3 shops grown into 7, and me still working the floor the entire time, because I never trusted a spreadsheet more than my own 2 hands. Then I told her the rest. I hold 74% of the voting shares. Monroe Legacy Holdings owns 5 parcels of land under those shops. Almost 100 people draw a paycheck because of what my family built. Combined, the business and the land are worth somewhere close to $30 million. I don't work for the Monroe family, I told her. I'm the one responsible for making sure what the Monroe family built doesn't disappear. I watched Melody move through it in stages. First, disbelief. She stared at the keys like I might be exaggerating. Then calculation. Every phone call. Every manager who'd waited on my decision. Every supplier who'd called me Mr. Monroe while she stood right beside me. Then shame. Realizing the signs had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. And underneath it all, fear. Because if Warren knew more about my business than she did, she may have just handed her boyfriend the keys to her own husband's company. Watching her face, I understood something I hadn't let myself say out loud before. Melody wasn't ashamed because she'd been wrong about a number. She was ashamed because she'd built an entire justification for leaving on top of a version of me that never existed. And if that version was false, the choice she'd been proud of wasn't brave, it was just uninformed. Underneath the shame was something raw, the fear that she'd traded a real, steady love for the mere appearance of a bigger one. And there was no way to test that fear without admitting the last 7 months might have been a mistake she couldn't afford to name out loud. That's why she reached for anger instead of grief in that moment. Anger was faster, and it didn't require her to sit with what she'd actually lost. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. I didn't dodge it. I think I believed that if you loved the mechanic, you didn't need to know how much the mechanic owned. Then the harder truth. I turned our marriage into a test only I knew the questions to. I let that sit before I drew the line that mattered more. But I never hid how I lived or how I showed up for this family. The numbers, you didn't know. The man you saw every day of your life. I saw a man who didn't want more, she said quietly. No, I told her. You saw a man who never needed to perform for you to know who he was. Then I placed 3 things on the table, one at a time. First, a photograph of a Buick Grand National, my father's car, the last one we ever restored together. I told her it had been sold 12 years earlier to cover the tuition gap for her executive program. The same night I'd already put a deposit down on a garage of my own on Michigan Avenue. I canceled that deal. I sold my father's car. I never told her because I didn't want her earning that degree feeling like she owed me something. You let me think I did that on my own, she said. I wanted you to have it clean, I told her. Second, the spare key to her mother's house. I reminded her, gently, of the 9 months I spent driving her mother to physical therapy, managing medication, sleeping in a hospital recliner while still opening the shop at 4:30 every morning. I didn't bring it up for credit. I brought it up because she'd once told Warren at a party that she carried that crisis alone, while I stood a few feet away holding drinks she'd asked me to fetch. You don't owe me a medal, I said. But you don't get to erase me from the room just to make leaving easier to live with. Third, the letter from Dearborn, 10 years old, offering me a regional service position across Chicago, Indianapolis, and Cleveland at 3 times my salary. I told her I'd already bought a suitcase. I turned it down 3 days before signing, the same week she needed surgery and couldn't bear an empty waiting room. You called me unambitious for standing still, I told her. You never knew I was standing still to hold your hand. She didn't have a number that could answer that. This wasn't about her leaving a poor man for a rich one anymore. It was about realizing she'd misjudged a man who had spent years quietly putting her ahead of himself. Why are you telling me all this? She asked, her voice thinner now. So I feel like I owe you? No, I said. You don't owe me a marriage just because I sacrificed for it. I let a beat pass. But you owe the truth one thing. Stop using a false version of my life to make your choice look braver than it was. Then I opened a second folder and showed her the blueprint underneath. 20 apprentice files, purchased equipment, instructor contracts, a paid apprenticeship budget. The storage floor Warren wanted to gut wasn't sitting empty. It was becoming Monroe Skills Lab. You didn't just hand him numbers about a garage, I told her. You helped him calculate how many people he'd need to clear out to make the land look more appealing. She insisted Warren had spoken about revitalizing the neighborhood, about keeping some employees on. I handed her the missing page 25. She saw the real plan. Poaching our best people, cutting the rest loose, closing 2 locations entirely. He never told me any of this, she said. And for the first time, I heard something honest crack through her voice. Then, as she reached for her bag to stand, a small black memory card slipped out and hit the floor. The label read MMW, Transition. She said Warren had given it to her, calling it a plan to protect jobs. I plugged it into an offline laptop. Inside was an internal presentation, broken into phases. Erode Melody's confidence in the business. Use her for data and access. Leverage the divorce itself to force a lower price. Then, close facilities, sell equipment, redevelop the land. Phase 1 scheduled Warren's personal site visit to Livernois for the exact week Melody was set to move out. Timed so that if I pushed back on anything, it would read as a wounded husband lashing out, not a business owner protecting real assets. He hadn't stumbled into my garage that morning by accident. He'd walked in on a date his own plan had picked for him. And near the bottom, if the husband objects, emphasize divorce cost and asset division pressure. Who referred your divorce attorney? I asked her. Warren, she said. I let the silence sit. He didn't wait for our marriage to fall apart. He built the fall into his spreadsheet. Harmony walked in a few minutes later with a fresh report. Warren had taken out a bridge loan, valued his project on the assumption he'd already secured the Monroe land, and told investors my family had agreed in principle. There was no signature, no letter of intent, no written approval of any kind. That explains how he plans to take it, Harmony said. It doesn't yet explain where he found the money to promise investors in the first place. Harmony had one more thing before she closed her folder. Buried in the loan file was an internal memo thread, and one name kept surfacing. A chief financial officer at Warren's company who'd flagged the property valuation as unverified more than once, without ever getting a straight answer. Whoever that is, Harmony said, knows more about how this deal was built than Warren's ever going to admit. I'd want to be in the room when she finds out you're the one asking questions. Melody asked how much he'd borrowed. Harmony slid the number toward me instead. It was large enough to make Warren's entire company depend on this deal closing. I closed the folder. Tomorrow, I'm going to see Warren. What are you going to do? Melody asked. Nothing, I told her, except tell him the truth. What truth? I looked at the 7 keys, then the memory card. That he borrowed millions to buy something that was never his to take, from a man he never respected enough to actually get to know. Tomorrow, Warren Calloway is about to learn exactly who he's been trying to outmaneuver, and what he signed his own company up for, without knowing it. I drove to Warren Calloway's office the next morning. A glass tower off Woodward, the kind of building where the elevator plays soft jazz, and every surface reflects light meant to make you feel small. I wore a plain dark blazer over an open-collar shirt. No tie. I didn't need one. Harmony had offered to come with me. I told her this part I needed to do alone, the same way I'd handled every difficult conversation in my life. Face first, no audience, no performance. The receptionist behind the desk barely looked up when I gave my name. That told me something too. Warren hadn't warned his own staff that the man from the garage on Livernois Avenue might come calling. He still didn't think I mattered enough to prepare for. Warren's assistant tried to stop me at the desk, but Warren stepped out himself when he heard my name, still not placing my face until I said it plainly. Up close, in daylight, he looked exactly like a man who'd built himself on purpose. The beard trimmed to a hairline edge, the small scar near his right temple catching the light. Every inch of him arranged like a photograph of success rather than the thing itself. Kendrick Monroe. We met on Livernois Avenue. You told me to give my card to my boss. I watched something shift behind his eyes. Recognition. Then a flicker of calculation. The same look I'd seen on the security footage of his man testing our back door. I own Monroe Motor Works, I told him. All 7 locations. All the land under them. I also own the deal you've been building for the last 6 months. Warren recovered fast. That's the thing about a man like him. He doesn't panic. He pivots. He offered me a seat, coffee, a tour of his vision for the site. I didn't sit. I'm not here for your pitch, I said. I'm here because you took out a loan against land you never had the right to promise anyone. That's when a woman stepped into the doorway behind him. Mid-30s, sharp glasses, a laptop bag over one shoulder, twisting a pen once in her fingers before she spoke. Chloe Mercer, Warren's CFO. I didn't know her yet, but she clearly knew exactly why I'd come. Mr. Monroe, she said, before you two go any further, there's something you should see. And something I should say out loud, because I'm not going to carry it quietly anymore. Warren's jaw tightened. "Chloe, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," she said. Chloe laid documents across the glass conference table. Loan paperwork, investor memos, a signature page. She pointed to a paragraph added after the date Melody had actually signed a preliminary data sharing form. Back when Melody believed she was simply helping value a potential sale, not authorizing anything binding. "The language here," Chloe said, tapping the page, "was inserted after her signature. It reads as if your wife represented the Monroe family's intent to sell. She never wrote that. It was added." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not for me, for Melody. Whatever she'd done, whatever pain she'd caused me, she hadn't signed away a family business. Someone had built a version of her signature into a lie large enough to bankrupt a stranger. "You altered a document to make it look like my wife committed my family's land," I said. "She gave us the data," Warren said. "She wanted this deal as much as I did." "She wanted her marriage over," I told him. "That's not the same as authorizing the sale of 100 people's jobs." Standing there, I understood Warren clearer than I ever had. He wasn't chasing Melody because she moved him. He was chasing an opening. And underneath the tailored suit and easy charm was a man terrified of being exposed as smaller than his own image. That fear didn't start with us. It started years earlier, the first time a deal collapsed under his name and investors began asking questions his charm couldn't answer. So he needed a stake big enough to prove otherwise, right now, before this quarter's numbers came due. Even if it meant building a woman's signature into a lie to buy himself one more season of looking undefeated. Chloe kept going. Warren had personally guaranteed the loan using projected revenue from the Monroe properties he never had a signed agreement for. When she raised concerns internally, he told her the paperwork would resolve itself once the divorce closed. She'd stayed quiet for weeks, afraid of losing her position, until she realized the exposure could land on her own license, not just his. "I have copies," she told me. "Emails, drafts, the version before the added language and the version after. I kept them because I knew a day like this one might come, and I didn't want to be the only person left holding what he actually did." She told me she'd joined Warren's company 3 years earlier, drawn in by the same kind of polish that had drawn Melody. The tailored suits, the talk of vision, the promise that this was a man building something that mattered. It had taken her the better part of those 3 years to understand that Warren's vision only ever pointed in one direction, toward whatever kept Warren looking bigger than he actually was. Warren tried a different angle. "Kendrick, be reasonable. We can restructure this. Your wife wants this deal. I can make sure you walk away whole." "She's not your leverage," I said, "and she's not going to be your scapegoat either." That was the moment I made my choice, right there in that glass office, and it mattered more than anything I'd said to Melody at my kitchen table. I had every reason, every piece of evidence, to let Warren pin the fraud entirely on my soon-to-be ex-wife and walk away clean myself. Instead, I looked at Chloe. "I need everything you have showing that language was added after her signature," I told her. "Not to protect Warren, to make sure the truth lands on the person who actually wrote the lie." Chloe nodded slowly, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask her to do the right thing instead of the safe one. I called Melody that afternoon and asked her to meet me and Harmony at the Livernois shop, in the same office where my father used to run this whole operation from a single desk. When she arrived, I laid it out plainly. The altered signature page, the loan built on a lie, Chloe's willingness to testify to what actually happened. Melody read the altered paragraph twice. Her hand pressed against her mouth. "He built this to make it look like I did this?" she said quietly. he was never going to let me walk away clean either. No, I told her. He wasn't. I watched something break in her that had nothing to do with me anymore. She'd spent months believing she'd traded a small life for a bigger one, standing beside a man who saw the future. What she was looking at now was a man who'd been measuring her usefulness since the day they met, fully prepared to let her name absorb the fallout of his own fraud the moment it became convenient. I need you to understand something, I told her, and Harmony didn't stop me. I could let this fall on you. I have enough here to make sure it does. Warren would let it happen without blinking. I'm not going to. Why not? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because justice isn't about how much pain I can cause, I said. It's about putting the truth back where it belongs. That's not you. It never was. Harmony gathered Chloe's files, the loan documents, and the memory card from the night before into a single binder. She looked at me. This is bigger than a divorce now, Kendrick. It's a fraud case, and it's going to move fast once the bank sees what we have. Outside, through the shop window, I could see Devon closing up a bay for the night, unaware that the biggest reversal of this whole story was happening 20 feet away in my father's old office. Melody sat very still, staring at paperwork that proved she'd been used exactly the way Tyrone once warned me she might be. Chosen not for who she was, but for what she could unknowingly open the door to. What happens now? She asked. I thought about the night she'd called Warren an upgrade, standing in our kitchen, so certain she'd traded a small man for a bigger one. I didn't say it out loud. She was already seeing it herself, in real time, in the way her hands wouldn't stop moving across the edge of that binder. I closed the binder. Now Warren finds out that the same silence he used to survive every deal before this one isn't going to save him this time. What Warren Calloway does next, and what it finally costs him, is coming up next. The bank moved fast once Harmony delivered Chloe Mercer's files. Warren's bridge loan had been built on a deal that never legally existed, backed by a signature page altered after the fact. Within 2 weeks, the lender froze his line of credit and demanded immediate repayment. Investors who'd trusted his projections pulled out one by one, once they understood the asset behind the whole plan had never belonged to him in the first place. I didn't need to destroy Warren Calloway. His own paperwork did that the moment the truth caught up with it. Melody sat down with Harmony and me one final time before mediation closed out. She didn't need to be pushed into it. She recorded a voice memo, on her own, laying out everything. The data she'd shared, what Warren had told her about the deal, and the moment she realized her name had been used to cover a fraud she never agreed to commit. She didn't ask for forgiveness in that recording. She simply told the truth and let it stand on its own weight. I spent months believing I was choosing a bigger life, my wife told me, the last time we sat across from each other as husband and wife. I didn't realize I was choosing someone who needed me small enough to be useful. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. That same week, I finally opened the file Harmony had mentioned weeks earlier. The Monroe Stewardship Plan, drawn up by my father before he passed. It required any sale or transfer of core Monroe properties to be approved not by one person alone, but by a standing family council, including myself, my mother, and a representative of the Employee Welfare Fund that held 10% of the company. My father built that structure decades ago, after watching other black-owned businesses in this city get pressured into quick sales during hard years. He didn't want the future of this company to ever rest entirely on one man's grief, one man's temper, or one man's blind spot. That's why I told you not to open it too early, Harmony said. I needed you to understand your own family had already protected this business from a moment exactly like this one, long before you ever needed it to. It humbled me more than the reveal of my own ownership ever had. I'd spent this whole ordeal thinking I was the one holding everything up. My father had been holding it up longer than I realized, from years in the ground. Warren was never charged with anything violent, and this was never that kind of story. But the fraud in his loan paperwork drew the attention of his lender's legal team, and Chloe's documentation made it clear exactly whose hand had altered that signature page. Warren's company folded under its own weight within the month. Chloe left to start her own consulting firm, and later told me she'd stayed as long as she did only because she kept hoping Warren would choose honesty over convenience. He never did. I had every legal right and every emotional justification to let Melody's name get pulled into that collapse right alongside his. I chose not to push it there. Harmony helped make sure the record reflected what actually happened, that Melody had been misled and used, not that she'd orchestrated a fraud. That distinction mattered to me more than winning ever could have. Our divorce finalized quietly, without a courtroom battle over what I owned or what I owed her. I didn't fight her on a fair settlement. I also didn't return to her the one thing she asked for in our very last conversation. "Is there any chance," she asked me, "that we could try again, now that you know I understand?" "No," I told her, gently, because there was no reason left to be anything but honest. I can forgive what happened. I already have, in the ways that matter for my own peace. But forgiveness and rebuilding a marriage aren't the same thing. You didn't just fall for the wrong man. You spent 15 years standing next to me without ever getting curious enough to actually know who I was. I can't build a second chapter with somebody who only sees me clearly after the truth got handed to her on a table. She didn't argue. For the first time since this story started, she simply nodded and let the silence be enough. Melody didn't disappear from this story bitter or destroyed. Tyrone told me, months later, that she'd taken a job outside the industry entirely, started seeing a counselor, and had begun, quietly, without asking anyone to notice, volunteering 2 Saturdays a month at a financial literacy program for women rebuilding after difficult transitions. She never called to announce it. She never asked me to forgive her publicly. She simply started doing the kind of work that doesn't come with an audience, which told me more about her growth than any apology ever could have. Back at Livernois, our lead technician at the 8 Mile Road shop finally told me directly about the offer he'd been sitting on for months. I thanked him for his honesty and gave him a raise that had nothing to do with Warren's collapsed offer and everything to do with what he was actually worth to us. Devin kept showing up early, kept listening for the sounds that shouldn't be there, kept asking sharper questions every week. I stood in my father's office one evening, 7 brass keys back in the drawer where they belonged, and realized the fight had never really been about proving I was worth more than Warren Calloway. It had been about making sure the truth of who I was, quiet, steady, and fully in charge of my own life, finally got to stand in the light, instead of hiding behind a uniform nobody bothered to look past. What I built out of all of it, for Devin, for our employees, and for myself, is where this story finally comes home. Spring came to Detroit slower than usual the following year. But when it finally arrived, we opened the doors of Monroe Skills Lab on a Saturday morning in April, in the same storage space Warren Calloway once photographed through a side door, certain it was worth more empty than it ever was full. 20 folding chairs sat in rows across a concrete floor that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and engine oil, which is about the most honest smell I know. My mother, Justice Monroe, sat in the front row wearing my father's old denim jacket, the one she still keeps on a hook by her door for days that call for it. She didn't say much that morning. She didn't need to. She just reached over at one point and squeezed my hand the way she used to when I was young enough to still need reminding that quiet men can still be proud men. Devin Freeman stood at the front of that room in a new Monroe Skills Lab uniform. No longer the nervous 19-year-old worried about a docked paycheck over a late bus. Over 16 months, he'd worked through the full apprenticeship track and earned his diagnostic certification. And that morning, he'd shown up 2 hours before the ceremony just to walk the tool lockers one more time, making sure everything was in its place before anyone else arrived. That morning, I handed him something I hadn't told anyone I was planning: the keys to run daily operations at our newest 8-mile road expansion, under my supervision, but with his name on the schedule board. Someday, I told him, echoing what I'd said the first week we met, you'll be the one teaching somebody else to hear the sound that shouldn't be there. I think that day's today, he said. And for once, I let myself laugh out loud in front of a full room instead of keeping it to myself the way I'd done for most of my life. 20 families sat in those folding chairs that morning, and among them was the younger brother of the technician Warren once tried to poach out from under us. That young man had a seat in our very first cohort, tools waiting in a locker with his name already taped above it. Nobody in that room needed me to explain what it meant that both brothers still had a future standing on the same ground. Some things speak louder without a speech attached to them. Our HR lead read off the names of the Employee Welfare Fund's newest scholarship recipients. 3 technicians' children, headed to trade programs their parents could never quite afford on their own. My father built that fund before I was old enough to understand what it was protecting us from. Watching it still working, decades later, felt like shaking his hand across a distance neither of us could measure. I don't hide who I am anymore. Not because I need anyone's applause, but because I finally understood that humility was never supposed to mean erasing myself so someone else's smaller version of my life could stand in for the truth. I still work the floor most mornings. I still drink black coffee out of the same steel thermos. I still drive my father's old truck. But I also stand up now, at community meetings and city planning sessions, as the man whose name is actually on the license behind the counter. Because a legacy only stays alive when somebody's willing to claim it out loud. Warren Calloway's name doesn't come up much anymore. His company folded quietly, the way over-leveraged things usually do once the story underneath them collapses. Chloe Mercer built something steadier out of the wreckage, and last I heard, she still keeps a copy of that altered signature page as a reminder of the year she chose honesty over a paycheck. Melody and I don't speak often, but Tyrone tells me she's still doing the quiet work nobody applauds, the volunteering, the counseling, the slow rebuilding of a person willing to actually get curious about the people in her life instead of assuming she already knows them. I hope that continues for her. I mean that. Peace doesn't require someone else's ruin to feel complete. This story reminds us that a good man's worth was never sitting in a bank account or a title. It always lived in the sacrifices nobody kept score of, but him. If you're the wife, the mother, or the grandmother listening tonight, here's something small and real. Not for someday, but for this week. If he's still beside you, find the coffee mug he reaches for every morning, the chipped one you've almost thrown out a dozen times. And tonight, before he sees it, tuck a folded note underneath, naming one specific thing he did for you this year that you never said out loud. If he's already gone, take down the toolbox, the tackle box, the recipe tin, whatever object still smells like him in the back of a closet. And this Saturday, Hand it to a grandchild yourself and tell them one true, specific story about the day it mattered most. Not a eulogy, just one object, one story, one person listening across the table. That's the whole assignment. Because the quiet ones in stories like this were never loud about what they carried. And if you keep waiting for a grand enough moment to say thank you, that moment has a way of closing on its own, without asking permission. Say it small. Say it specific. Say it this week, over coffee, at the kitchen table, the way it was always meant to be said. In one true sentence, to one person, about one thing that actually happened. I built Monroe Skills Lab so the next generation would have somewhere to learn that showing up quietly is never the same as standing still. And every morning I unlock that garage door on Livernois Avenue, I do it as a man who finally stopped hiding. Not because the world demanded proof of what I was worth, but because I decided my own peace was worth more than anyone else's opinion of how loud I should have been all along. This story was written by a human, with AI as a companion. It was born from a simple wish, to awaken the belief that kindness still exists, and no matter how many trials life brings, there are always moments of justice and quiet miracles waiting for those who deserve them.